Okay, here we are with Kevin Chemidlin from Grow the Show. How you doing today, buddy?
Chris, I'm so pumped to be here, man. Love helping podcasters, so really excited to dive in.
Yeah, I mean, when did you first decide? I know you had the other podcast, but when did you decide to make the switch from the Philly Who podcast to the Grow the Show podcast? When did you make that switch?
Yeah, so I think a lot of us underwent some life trajectory changes when COVID hit. I don't know if I can speak for everyone, but basically 2018 and 2019, I did Philly Who. For 2019, I did Philly Who full-time. 2018 was when I launched the show, was a full-time creator, quote unquote, in 2019. I hadn't even heard that term yet at the time, but that's what it was. And then in 2020, when COVID happened and everything got shut down, I'm in Philly, so the city got completely shut down, and all of my interviews for my Philly show got canceled because it was also just like a weird time to interview somebody about their success story when like nobody knew what was going on at the time. So
now, were these in-person interviews?
They were, yes. I had never done a remote interview up until this point. So all my interviews got canceled, and I had some podcast consulting and like editing work that stuck around that I was able to use to like pay my bills. But for like 2 or 3 months, I kind of had nothing to do because my show wasn't being produced. So I got in touch with a bunch. I had gotten to know a bunch of podcasters over the course of my first 2 years as a podcaster. And so I started reaching out to a bunch and just saying, hey, like I'm looking to understand where you're at. I had an idea that I could probably help other podcasters because I had taken my show past 6 figures in revenue just in its second year.
Wow, that's
and
great.
So I was like, yeah, thanks, man. It was, I mean, looking back, it was, I very much stumbled into it. But I knew, like, I had a bunch of podcasters reaching out to me asking if I could answer questions about what I did with the Philly show. So I don't know. There was like a month, I want to say like April or May or 2020, I got on like 30 Zoom calls with different podcasters of all shapes and sizes. Podcasters who are indie. Some of them were like working for big media companies for shows that you've heard of. Some of them were like startups that had podcasts. And across the board, all 30 conversations, every single person was like, how do I grow this thing? And how the heck do I monetize it? And so by the 30th time I heard that, I was like, there seems to be a common set of problems here that I think I could help solve. So, like I said, with the Philly show with the Philly show just on hold indefinitely, I started helping podcasters individually, and growtheshow.com was available. So I was like, why don't I give this thing a shot? And that was when Grow the Show was born almost 5 years ago.
Now, was this during the pandemic when this all went down? Like middle of it all?
That's right. Oh, in the
when everybody was locked down. I think a lot of people, they were locked down, yeah, and they had no other thing to really do other than make a podcast, and that's when you saw a big surge of these podcasts hit the market. I think a lot of those funsy pop-up podcasts are gone, I think, by now.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's some that are still around, but I just see in the communities and the groups and social media, things like that, I just see a lot of them falling off, and a lot I mean, it was fun. It's a fun hobby. I guess if you're bored and you're just watching Tiger King, whatever you're doing at home, eating chips or whatever. Yeah. So you help out these podcasters that reached out to you. Same thing here. That's why Podcastic Audio started, because people were asking me questions about my other show I was doing, and they're asking me, how do you make it sound so great? All this technical stuff. And I'm like, well, I don't have a technical background, and I don't have a lot of technical gear. I've got simple stuff. So what are you using over there? What do you got? Because I'm using basic stuff and I sound great. Why do you sound like crap? I don't know. So that's kind of where the show started. But that's great that you help people out and you help podcasters out and new podcasters out. So what are some of the common things they would ask you back then?
I mean, it's the same thing I get asked today, which is, how do I get more listeners? How do I monetize? Or those are the two questions that always folks lead with. And what I have found is that most shows, their growth strategy and their monetization strategy, I mean, a lot of them don't have a monetization strategy yet, but for most shows, most of them think that they have a growth problem, but they actually have other issues that are hindering growth. And like I said, that is just hands down, anytime I meet a podcaster, big or small, for the first time, that's the question I get asked. And in fact, the podcast industry, I don't know if you've experienced this, but the whole industry downloads are down. industry wide this
Across
year.
the board, we're saying, right? Everywhere.
Across the board. Yep. And so
By how
I
much
actually
do you
just
think
did
percentage-wise? Like, if you take a percentage down-wise.
It depends on a couple things. So I don't have like a podcast listenership is down X%. It depends very much on how often the show publishes and also how old the show is. So shows that have a much bigger back catalog tend to have been much more affected. And also shows that publish more often have been more affected than shows that have less of a catalog. Well, a huge catalyst, first of all, is in October of last year, Apple Podcasts made an update to their algorithm for how the app decides what episodes should be downloaded to people's phones. So the shows that published a lot and the shows that had a huge back catalog, once that update went into effect, a bunch of phones downloaded far fewer episodes than previously. So, those shows, which a lot of those shows are monetized with ad revenue by how many downloads that they get, they were no longer getting a bunch of downloads that were not actually being listened to, if that makes sense. So people's phones were downloading these episodes from the back catalog or automatically downloading these daily episodes, and these people were never listening to them, but they were still getting a credit for a download. So Apple kind of fixed, which is kind of a problem. Like Apple fixed this.
Yeah,
right?
But I would rather have a listen than an actual download that never gets listened. I'd rather have someone actually listen to the episode.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
in a way, it's actually a good thing because people are actually really, truly listening. Those downloads mean listens, kind of, right?
They more so now than before. They mean listens. They still don't fully, right? But the bigger shows that I spoke to, the ones who have done well, who have done better, are the ones who said that. They're like, it really sucks that our downloads are down, but honestly, I would rather have a more accurate picture. There's other shows that don't care. They just want higher downloads and they're still upset. But that was a major blow to the podcasting industry. And then there's just one other thing that this is my own theory as to why listenership is down. I think like there is, if we look at our screen time on our phones, our screen time keeps going up. Everybody's spending more and more time on their phones. But the thing is, they're spending more and more time looking at their phones, reading stuff on social media, and watching videos on social media and on YouTube. So our time looking at stuff has gone up. Well, people's time listening to stuff hasn't really changed as much because it's a very routine medium. Podcast listeners listen while they are commuting or working out. It's a thing in their weekly routine that doesn't really... They're not working out more. They're not commuting more. If anything, they're commuting less. So there's there's not as much growth in the amount of time people are spending consuming podcasts as compared to video and text-based social media and media, right? So my theory is there's more competition in terms of the quality of podcasts that are available, but the amount of listen minutes total has not changed. So it's more difficult now, I think, to get a listener and keep them than it was previously.
Oh, that's interesting. I think also the fact that obviously 2020 caused a big surge of podcasts in the market. So I know that if you had a podcast back in 2010, you probably, it was easy to get listeners, because there's only a small number of channels. Same thing with YouTube too. If you got in YouTube back in 2006 or whatever, 5, whatever it was, I'm sure, it was easier to get views on something over there too. Do you think the market is a little too saturated? Is that the problem with some people are saying?
I don't think it's saturated because everybody says that, right? Like there's like, oh my gosh, there's now almost 4 million podcasts available on Apple Podcasts. But here's the thing. Almost 4 million of those shows have given up. There's only 300 to 400,000 podcasts actually publishing regularly. And I got that from the CEO of a podcast database company. I tweeted at him and I said, hey, look at your database right now. How many shows published an episode in the last 90 days? He said, it's showing 300-ish thousand. So I was like, wow, even though there's almost 4 million in the directory, there's really only 300 to 400,000 shows publishing regularly. So while I don't think it's necessarily saturated, I think the competition is higher, right? I think podcasting has been around for 15 years now. So the people who are good at it, who have been doing it for a while, are really good at it, right? They're really good at making an amazing show and keeping people listening throughout. What's also true is that podcast episodes are long. So the best shows in the world are very, very long. And if a podcast listener has only 6 hours a week to listen to podcasts, three of them might be taken up by this one giant show that everybody knows the name of and likes to, talk about.
Yeah, that might have a president on the show, like I say the name of it, but what I'm saying.
Exactly, right. So that's another thing is I think that the fact that this was an election year had an impact. In 2020, we saw a lot of listenership go to shows that were like about the pandemic, and shows that weren't about the pandemic suffered a little bit. And I think that there was a little bit of that going on this year as well, because everyone in the U.S. anyway has been so wrapped up in the election that a lot of people have switched to consuming political content. My hope, and I guess we'll see soon, is whether that kind of evens back out now that the election's over.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering about that too. It's almost like when you're on YouTube and you like watch one video and then they say, "Oh, you like more of those? Here's some more. Here's some more. Here's some more," and you kind of get consumed into it. And it's just I think people are kind of like, they kind of like to watch or listen to things that they're really into in the moment. Maybe like all of a sudden I bought a new sports car and I'm like, oh, I want to learn more about that kind of car or that or what I can do. So I start watching content based on that. I wonder if it has something to do with the election too, because the election's going on and a lot of people are kind of picking sides and seeing what's going on, or it's almost like some of those like TMZ podcasts and TMZ stuff. It's like whatever's happening right now in the media, what's happening with the celebrities, what's happening right now. People are drawn to that kind of stuff because it's happening in the moment. But going back to you're saying about the 4 million podcasts, but those 4 million podcasts, if they're on free platforms like, say, Anchor or whatever it is now, Spotify, they still are live. Like even on YouTube, I mean, I don't think unless you... Does the YouTube ever pulls channels? Do they ever shut them down if they're not being used?
I don't think so.
So they're still there. So technically you're still physically there. Right. You're still there on the actual platform, so you can still consume it. But nothing new is getting added to that channel. So it's all old content. Which I'm sure if you Google search into YouTube, I'm sure some of these older things pop up. I mean, I've gotten views on videos I posted probably 15 years ago, Yeah, so there's something to consider with that.
And that's something that, like, it's important for audio podcasters to understand as well, is that YouTube has an algorithm like that, and YouTube has SEO like that, where you can, like, there are videos from a decade and a half ago that are still getting views because of the YouTube algorithm. Podcast audio does not have an algorithm. I like to say to the podcasters that I serve, you are your own algorithm. Like, if you stop promoting your show and you stop doing things that get people to not only find out that your show exists, but remember that your show exists, your downloads will stop. Right? So that's something that a lot of podcasters don't really understand. They think that a podcast is like almost every other medium, where if you post something on social media, especially today, if you post a video on Instagram, like a reel or something, or a TikTok or whatever, and it's good, it could get 1 million views just with no background. Like, a brand new account could do that. Similarly on YouTube, number one, there's videos that are 10 years old that are still getting views today. And the same thing is true, where you can put up a YouTube video, and if it is good and it has the right structure that YouTube understands, it'll get views right away. An audio podcast doesn't have that. We do, like, if you put an audio podcast episode up and you do nothing to promote it and nothing to go get people to find out that it exists and tune in, it could be literally the best episode that has ever been recorded, but it'll never be heard. So I share that.
That's crazy, man. That's weird.
It's crazy, and it's like also a bummer on the surface. And I mean, the first 20 minutes of our conversation today, we've been talking about how hard podcasting is and what's gone wrong with it. And I don't mean, we don't talk about that stuff to be a bummer. I say that stuff so that audio podcasters understand what it is, what the audio podcast world is like, and hopefully understand that if their show is not growing and their show does not have a huge audience, they might not be in as bad of a situation as they think, because it is so hard to grow. It is just so different than every other medium that is currently online. So that's the main message that I want to get across, is that this thing is just different than the others.
It is. And I think that I think a lot of podcasters see the YouTube algorithm and they think that there's a algorithm with podcasting too, or something like that, or whatever. And they try to figure that out, and then they realize, I've seen this firsthand, they'll realize that my audio podcast version may get like super small downloads, but the YouTube video version gets like a ton. And so they're like going to abandon the audio side because they think, well, that doesn't work, obviously. I'm going to go jump on the YouTube side because I'm getting the algorithm to feed me my stuff and feed the content and whatever, how that goes. But knowing that there's no algorithm for a podcast, what are some tips and tricks you can give us to help, get those numbers up?
Yeah. So there's basically two main tips or tricks. And I say to literally any podcaster, doesn't matter if you're a new one, if you've been podcasting for years, doesn't matter what your show genre is, you want to be doing one of two things always if you're still podcasting. Thing number one is take advantage of the other algorithms. So some of the biggest, most explosive audio podcast growth that I have seen with the shows that I've come across and worked with, where I can actually see their data, they have grown in one of two ways. Either they have done something outside of their podcast on another platform that has an algorithm. So social media, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, something that does have an algorithm baked in. They become a creator there and then grow there and also send some of their audience to their audio podcast. That's number one. And I know people are like, that sounds like a lot of work. It's enough work to make my own. Yeah, right. It is.
Right.
Sorry. But the truly explosive growth that I have seen has come from that. Someone either got really good at one social media platform or they got really good at putting their episode on YouTube in a way that YouTube likes and gets growth on YouTube. So that's number one, take advantage of an algorithm on another platform. Number two is you kind of create your own algorithm by collaborating with other podcasts. That's the one that I think every single audio podcaster should do, because if you think about it, if you ask me the question, how do I grow my podcast? What you're really asking is, how do I get more people who listen to podcasts on a regular basis to find out that mine exists and choose it, right? The next time that they listen. Yeah. That's what goes into your podcast growing. What better place is there to find podcast listeners than other podcasts that already have listeners, right? They're already there. Other podcasters have already done the work of gathering your future audience. All you have to do is collaborate with those podcasters, which is much easier said than done. But you collaborate with those shows so that you or your show gets mentioned on those other feeds, and that makes all those listeners be like, oh, wow, I should go check out Chris's show.
Yeah, definitely. That's why, you're here, and I've gone on other shows too. It's I think being interviewed on other people's podcasts and sharing stuff is a great way to do that. And what are your thoughts on the old-fashioned audio, whether the feed swaps or audio swaps or show promo swaps, things like that? Those do anything?
Oh, they can be incredibly effective. And there are some podcasters I know, I can mention Jordan Harbinger as one of them. He's a massive podcaster, has an unbelievably huge audience. And if you ask him, if you come across him at a conference and you say, Jordan, what's the one thing I could do to grow my show? He will say swaps every single time. And there's other big audience podcasters who will say the same thing. That I've had a lot of them on my show, grow the show. And like I said, just having conversations with them, they swear by it. However, there's also a lot of podcasters who are like, I tried that and it didn't work. And here's why. You have to swap with a podcast that has an audience. Another big challenge of audio podcasting is we can't see how big the audience is of other podcasts. It is entirely private. YouTube is not like that. You can see how many subscribers they have. Social media, you can see how many followers. Audio podcasts, nobody has any idea except you how many downloads you have. And the same thing is true. If you go and find another show and you're like, my gosh, this show is just the exact perfect thing. Let me swap with this show. That show might only have 50 listeners. So that's the big thing that I see when people are like, I've tried a million swaps. It really hasn't done anything for me. Number one is, are you swapping with shows that have a significant listener base, which can be tough, but still, that's the first place to look is, are you doing a swap? Or is your swap actually getting in front of listeners, right?
Right. Well, on that note, what about shows that are also in the same parallel with your show, meaning same kind of content? Because you could try to promote your horror movie podcast on the Susie Homemaker, baking goods show or whatever, and I don't think people aren't gonna care about your horror movie podcast on that. I see a lot of, in the early days of the pandemic, a lot of podcasters do that. They'll throw their promos on every little thing, no matter how generic, how random the show is, and that could be a reason why a lot of them don't work either.
Oh, 100%. And so I say like swapping on easy mode. Yes, focus on shows that you like it's a similar topic, similar content, like as much as possible. You can achieve it on expert mode. There is a way where you can like identify, okay, I have certain people listening to my show. They might also be interested in this other type of genre. I've seen that work before, like as an example. I've seen comedy shows swap with parenting shows and get a lot of results because, you know, like new parents, I guess, I don't know, listen to comedy podcasts. I'm not sure. But that's, like I said, super, super expert mode. So it can work going cross genre, but 99 times out of 100, the advice is just stick within your genre, find shows, ideally that are about the same size you are, swap with them so that your show starts to grow. And as your show grows, try swapping with shows, you know, that are bigger as your show gets bigger.
Now, if you're swapping with a show that you think is the same size, how would you know that? Is there? I mean, obviously it's all private. You know, the stats are all private. So how would somebody find out or get a rough idea, like how many listeners a show would have?
So number one, you can ask, just straight up ask, hey, level with me.
But people lie about. You know, people lie about.
They
that
do,
stuff.
Right? They lie. So while there's no true way to know unless you got their login information for their hosting platform, the two platforms that I go to is. You can look at Listen Notes, which is an online database. They have a metric that they assign to, like, it's called Listen Score. And what they do is they assign a listen score to podcasts that are in their database based on their best guess. Now, they have a bunch of metrics that they use to guess the relative size of shows. But again, it's like relative. So I think my listen score is like 45 or something like that. And it's like, what does that mean, right?
Right.
So what I do is if I'm using Listen Notes, I will try to look for other shows that are around the 45 mark. The other tool that you can use, it's another podcast database. It's called Riphonic. That one, if you pay for it, they have actually, I don't know if you have to pay for it to get the estimated audience size, but they similarly have a metric that they calculate. They try to estimate how many listeners per episode a show has. I have found that in many cases, it is accurate. Every once in a while, it's not, but you know, like I said, if I'm pitching shows, like if I'm trying to swap with other shows or be a guest on other shows, I usually go to Riphonic and see what the guess is. And then finally, if you don't want to use those tools, if you don't want to pay for them or whatever it is, my favorite shortcut is to just see how many reviews a show has. Like if a show on Apple Podcasts has more than 100 reviews, I'm like, okay, there's people listening to this. If it's less than that, I'm like,
or there are lots of guest interviews and they require that the guest leave a review. I've seen that time and time again.
I have too. I've been on one of those shows. And I'm like,
oh, really? Where they said you have to leave a review? You have to leave a review before. No way. Yeah, I've heard about that.
What's funny is I thought that was a huge show because I was like, wow, this show's got 450 reviews. Then I was a guest and I was like, oh, it's kind of like one time I went to a restaurant in South Carolina and I was like, my God, they've got 1,000 5-star reviews. This is going to be amazing. And I went there and the food was okay. And at the end, they stood over me and asked me to review on Google and
no
let
way.
me leave until I did. I was like, oh, this is how they have so many reviews. So anyway, you're right. But most of the time I have found in most cases it is legit.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember on the other show a while ago, there was a show that was asking us on social media to do a review swap. And I was like, I kind of felt weird about it. I kind of icky about doing this, just swap to swap. I'm like, you don't even know my show. I don't even know your show. And I'm thinking I just felt weird about it. So I didn't do it. I was like, and the guy got mad at me. Got started getting angry towards me for not wanting to swap with because and then I look at his Apple and it had 300 reviews on there. I'm like, what do you need my review for? You already have 300. I think once you get to a certain threshold of reviews, I don't think it makes a difference anymore. If you have 300, 400, 500 reviews and they're all the same, great show, love the host, or whatever, and it's the same thing over and over again. Honest to God,
it's
I swear to you, I have never looked at a review in my life on a show that I subscribe to.
Right.
Ever.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get it. It's like someone wearing a muscle suit trying to act like they're strong. Like you can kind of tell that it's a suit compared to actually getting strong.
Halloween and stuff. Yeah, but someone told me this once a while ago that podcasting's free. There's no charge to listen. So if you don't like the show, sample it. Don't like it, move on. Where versus say Amazon, where you're going to buy a product, you see all the reviews and you kind of see what people said about the product, and you're like, do I want to spend my money on this or not? All you're talking about is spending maybe a few minutes on a podcast, whether you like it or not. and then you
Yeah.
move on. So for me, I've never gone to reviews on a show to see if I like a show or not. Even shows I subscribe to, like yours, I don't even know what your reviews look like. I've never seen them. I
Right.
don't look at them. It doesn't matter to
Right.
me, but
Yeah, and I think that's true. I think most podcast listeners don't really look at that. Where people do look at it is if, for the case that we're talking about, where it's like, oh, should we swap with this show? Should I be a guest on this show? Which, to your point, it can be faked.
So that's one metric to see whether or not a show has a decent sized audience. You're saying. So, and of course asking them, but if you do ask them, like I said, they probably lie to you or not want to give it up in the first place or whatever, and things like that. But another person told me once that you can kind of tell based on their social media size. Is that true?
Oh, I don't think so at all. I think there's not much of a correlation because you mean like social media audience size?
Right. So, for example, if a show a podcast, you see a podcast, but you can't see their metrics because they're hidden, and then you check out their social media, and you say, "Oh, they've got 10,000 followers on Instagram, and they got X amount of followers here. They must somewhat have a decent size." Ish.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's true at all. At all, actually.
Really?
I think I have seen a lot of big shows that have no social media presence, and I have seen a lot of people who have solid social media presence who come abject failure in podcasting, just could not get people to listen. And so, to me, like seeing someone with a large social media following, what that tells me is that person has a large following on that platform. That person has been really consistent, either bought followers, which you can usually tell, or they've shown up on that platform, been really consistent on that platform for a long time. That's all you can really tell from it. And it happens all the time that I hear from someone. I mean, I've had folks who have millions of followers on social media reach out to me to have a call and be like, I've got 2 million followers. Why is nobody listening to the show? And I'm like, because first of all, your show isn't good. Secondly,
you actually tell them that? You tell them that straight to their face?
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, no question. I mean, they're there. They asked, right? I'm like, and I'll say like permission to, be honest here.
Be honest.
And, I don't tell them their show sucks. Like I'm a little bit more, like I have a little more tact with it. But in more kind terms, I'll say, this show is not as good. And usually you can point to data. Like I can say, have you ever looked at your episode completion rate? And they'll be like, no, what's that? And I'll be like, open up your Apple Podcast dashboard. Let's take a look. And their completion rate is like 20%, which what we want is 65% or more. So I'm like, people, and there are former U.S. presidents who have quit podcasting because they thought that the fact that they had an audience elsewhere would mean that people would flock to listen to them on their show. But it is just simply not the case.
I think podcasting, the audio format side of it all, it's probably like the hardest thing to get of all the other things out there, like the Instagram, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the whatever. I think an actual audio podcast listener, or actual, to listen to your show, it's got to be hard. It's going to be a tough sell, I would think.
I always say it is the hardest fought audience relationship. I think it is the most valuable. Because podcast listeners, if you manage to get onto their grocery shelf, which they've got room for maybe 6 shows that they listen to every single week, and you're competing with the biggest shows, the biggest names, we are all competing with those shows. So if you can do that, it's hard to do, but if you can do that, then they're hearing from you every single week. The level of connection is unbelievable. But yeah, it's tough. And look, I'm the grow the show guy. I'm the podcast guy. Most cases when somebody asks me if they should launch a podcast, more often than not will say no. And a lot of times my advice is go grow a social media platform first. Go do like something a little bit smaller first. Grow your audience there. Take advantage of the tech platforms that want you to grow your audience on there. And if you get good at that, then you can, grow a podcast. Now, mind you, I first check to see like, why do you want to have a podcast? Are you genuinely passionate about it? Like, do you love podcasts? Do you love listening to them? Is there a show that you feel like should exist and doesn't yet? Like, do you love the medium that much? And are you cool understanding the fact that it is the hardest one to grow? If all of that is yes, then absolutely have at it. But in many cases, they're like, no, I just want to build an audience. And I'm like, if that's the case, then you should probably go elsewhere because this is literally the hardest one.
It is very hard. It's very tough to get listeners. And I know you've mentioned before about some podcasts will have people coming in, but people leaving out the other side, I think. So it's like you're bringing people in, great. You're promoting your show, great. You're putting it on social media, great. You're like, check out the new episode, come click on it and all that stuff. But doesn't have that sticky factor, so they're not staying around; they're just leaving. I know you mentioned this in your ladder structure, a framework you have presented. Can we go over that and go over your ladder frame and how it all works and
Totally.
What advice you have for podcasters that want to like grow that are stuck? You know?
Yeah. So any podcast that wants two things. Thing number one is they want the show to be growing. They want to see their audience growing every single month. And number two is the show is monetized. So the podcast is generating revenue. If you want those two things to be true, there's 4 things that you have to achieve, and you have to achieve all 4 of them. And so I call it the podcast ladder, because I've seen shows that achieve level 3, but they have not achieved level 1. So they're at 0 because they haven't gotten through step 1 yet. And then a lot of times when they fix step 1, they'll jump up to level 3, but you need all 4 and you need them in order. So let's talk through what those things are.
Great.
So the first thing that you need if you want a podcast that grows and monetizes is you need what I call a clear and unique premise. Clear and unique premise. What the hell does that mean? Well, the idea is this. When somebody pulls up your show, if they come across it somehow and they look at the show's title and the little thumbnail, right? And the description of the show, is it immediately clear who the show is for and what it is going to do for them? Not what you, the podcaster, are going to do on the show. Not, I'm going to interview successful people or I'm going to tell stories.
Right.
It's what is this show going to do for them, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you 2 examples of my shows. My current show, Grow the Show. What I don't say is, Grow the Show is the podcast where I, Kevin, a podcast expert, interview successful podcasters and share my wisdom. That's what I do on the show. What I instead say is, Grow the Show is the podcast that grows your podcast, right? So I say, this is what this show is going to do for you. Now, it's a little bit more straightforward for that show because it is an educational show. If your show is not educational, though, you still can do this. So my first show, which was called Philly Who, what did I do on the show? I interviewed successful and famous Philadelphians and told their stories. Okay, that's what I did. Now, back then, I used to say that's what the show was. This is before I really, really dug into this stuff to understand it and articulate it. If I brought Philly Who back now, because, by the way, I'm not making the show anymore because Grow the Show just so took over my life.
Right, yeah.
If I brought the show back now, I would say Philly Who is the podcast that connects you deeper with your city, that makes you more connected with the people of Philadelphia. See the difference? How it's not what I'm doing, but what the show is going to do for you. Make
right.
sense?
Yeah. I mean, everybody wants something that's in it for them. You know,
1,000%.
And it's sad. It's sad because I think as content creators, as podcasters, you want them to love us. They want us to do it because they love us and they love our material. You know, but I mean,
and the way that you get there is by making your material about the listener. If you just ruthlessly make it about them and what it's going to do for them and serving them, then they love you. Like, they make it about you. What's funny is when I launched Philly Who, I never mentioned my background, who I was. I would just say, you're listening to Philly Who. My name is Kevin, and today we're talking to this person. And after the show started to get some momentum, I had people writing in that were like, that were asking me about my story, and like I was being invited to speak on panels as an expert of Philadelphia, and I'm like, I'm not, and I was like, I'm not an expert. I'm just interviewing people who are doing things, and they're like, no, yeah, they were like fighting me on it. They're like, you're an expert, you're an incredible Philadelphian. So it's kind of backwards, but the more you make your show about your listeners, the more they make it about you, which is really
crazy.
What we all want in the end. Yeah,
right. Of course. I mean, that's kind of how it all works. That's how you actually get. So that's the step 1.
Step 1, and what I'll wrap up step 1 with is, if there's one simple test, is when you tell another human being in person what your show is. Number 1, you should be able to say it in 1 sentence, just 1 sentence. If it takes you 5 minutes, you've lost them. So you want to have a quick tagline. My tagline for Grow the Show, the podcast that grows your podcast. Very simple. When you tell that to somebody in person, if they are the right listener for your show, do their eyes light up? Or do their eyes glaze over? And if you're like, oh, you have a podcast that tells stories of these crimes that have happened, and people are kind of like, they glaze over and they're like, oh, that's really interesting. Then that's
really?
happening when other people discover your show, and that's a reason why your show isn't growing. But if they're like, whoa, and their eyes light up, that's when you're onto something. And that's just step 1.
Wow. Okay. So step 2?
Step 2, now that we have a clear and unique premise, Now we need to focus on keeping listeners. And this is the initial thing that you asked about, right? Most podcasters think that they have a growth problem when really what they have is a retention problem. I see it all the time where a podcaster, they do all kinds of stuff to promote their show. They post on social media. They're maybe showing up on other podcasts, whatever. But their download number stays the same. And they think that it's the same 100 people tuning in every episode. I'm stuck at 100 downloads per episode. I'm stuck at 100 people. I'm like, you're not stuck at 100 people. It's probably 20 people that come back every week. And then every week you've got 80 new people who listen to an episode and they're like, man, I don't know, this isn't that great. And then they never come back ever again. So it's an invisible churn. They think they have a growth problem, but they have a retention problem. And when that is the case, I'll say, like, look, until we get this fixed, I could go out and I could get you 1 million downloads next week. In 2 weeks, you'll be back to 100 unless we fix this. Right? So that's why I'm like, I don't care about growth. Are we keeping the people that tune in for an entire episode, step one? And then step two, are they coming back week after week? The number one thing you can look at to understand this is what we mentioned before, your completion rate. It's a metric that's given to you by Spotify for podcasters or Apple Podcasts Connect. You can log into an analytics dashboard and you'll get a percentage on average of all the people who listen to your episodes. What percentage did they actually listen to? And with every podcaster that I work with or that I help, I want to see 65% or more. If it's lower than that, that means that there's a hole in your show, right? It's like you're trying to fill a wicker basket with water. You're like, I just need a better faucet, right? It's like the water level doesn't rise. But when you get really good at retention, which involves understanding how to have a great intro to hook people in, understanding how to keep your show on topic and keep things moving and keep people interested. When you do that, then your show is a steel bucket. And then the same effort, the same faucet makes the water level rise quicker.
Perfect. That's great. I know that some shows you click on, you're like, what is this garbage I'm listening to? And you just like click turn it off, or it takes them like 10 minutes to get to any point on the show. And it's random stuff.
And that podcaster's like, I think I should run some Facebook ads. I really just need to grow this thing. Of course. It's like, no.
Throw more money at it. Just throw money at it. That'll be the thing,
Right. Everyone's like, I know it's not my content. It usually is.
That's the thing too, is that, when you ask somebody, when people, ask them about their show, because I was doing some reviews on some shows, and because they send me their show, ask me to give them a review, and one person, I gave like an honest review, but I was nice about it, but I gave them an honest review. And they like chewed me out and like yelled at me and like all kinds of stuff. Like, I'm like, it was hot garbage. It literally was hot garbage. Echo City, like probably sharing one Blue Yeti microphone in the middle of the living room, whatever, drinking beers and talking about who knows what. And I don't know what the show was even about, but it's totally horrible.
That's
but
the problem.
Right. And they're like, I think the problem when people say, check out my show, what they're really asking is, say yes, you love it too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. They don't want feedback. They want praise.
Right. Yes. It's just say it's great, and that's why. I was guilty of the same thing. I used to send my other show out too, and say, check it out. Tell me you love it too, and stuff, and that sort of thing. But I never really got any like real, true, like hardcore, like real feedback. And I think when people actually get the feedback, they either two things happen. They say, "Oh, I appreciate that," or they get mad. So
yeah.
Okay. So moving on. So that was number 2.
1 and 2 are the hardest parts. It's 80% of the folks. Now that's a guess. I would guess 80% of the folks that I work with, they have problems with number 1 or number 2, and they're hard to solve, right? Because it's a creative problem, right? You got to make your show better and more attractive. Once you get that, though, you have a show that has a clear premise. People get it right away what it's about. Your show keeps listeners. You're seeing retention rates above, completion rates above 65%. That's when we go to growth. And for level 3, we've already talked about it, right? We shared the 2 strategies. Level 3, I say, go get listeners where they listen. So I would recommend that all podcasters always have some sort of podcast-related growth strategy in progress. The number one thing to understand here is that just like you as a podcaster are super consistent with publishing episodes, podcasters understand, I got to be consistent. I'm going to set a schedule and I got to stick with it. I can't miss a single episode. That is good that we have collectively hammered that into our brains. But consistency of publishing alone is not enough. All the time, podcasters are like, I've been consistent for 10 years. Why isn't it growing? Because consistency of publishing isn't enough. You also must be consistent with marketing. It's got to be just a part of your weekly and your monthly routine, something that you also don't miss, just like you don't miss publishing.
How much
like I said,
percentage time-wise should you devote towards marketing your podcast versus creating the podcast?
Yeah, my usual rule of thumb is 50-50.
50-50? Okay.
50-50.
So
50-50.
50% creating, 50% marketing.
That's the rule of thumb. It's obviously different for everybody, but that's where I start with everyone. And I'm like, if you had to guess where you're at, they'll be like, 90%. It's really like, they'll say 90% creating and 10% marketing. And then when we like do a time study and look at the actual work that they did, it's more like 99-1. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, most of the time, because people remember they remember their marketing as taking longer because it didn't work and it sucked and it wasn't fun. And they're like, that took forever. And it's like, actually, no, it didn't. There was not a lot of time spent on it.
Oh, wow. That's crazy. Okay. So that is 3.
So once again, if you are collaborating with other shows, if you are showing up on social media or YouTube, pick one of those 3 things and get really good at it. Your show will start growing. And the last big question is, this is one I get all the time. How do I monetize my podcast? Right? Terrible question. Why? Well, I usually say, okay, at what moment is your podcast monetized? Right? When did you go from my podcast is not monetized and then something happened and now it was? What would you say to that, Chris?
Well, first off, I would say define monetizing your podcast dollar-wise, I would say, because the other show, we made $3. I thought we were monetized, right? But then people say, oh, I want to monetize enough to quit my job. That's a different level than the $3. So
100%.
It's easy to make the $3 or whatever it is, monetizing maybe one of those like pre-made ads or whatever, things like that. You make a few cents on those kind of things. So for actually making a podcast where it's monetized, I think you need an audience, because without an audience, who are you monetizing? And another thing too is I don't think your show itself, but I could be wrong here. I don't think your show itself is the thing for sale. I think the value that your show delivers, it's what's for sale. But it could be going off here on a tangent, but that's kind of what I was thinking.
Here's how I think about it, because I think you're on the right track. Here's how I think about it, because I've spent a lot of time trying to articulate this to teach it to other podcasters. And so this is what I usually say. I'm like, because usually I ask, like, at what point is your podcast monetized? And what podcasters usually say, whether it's $3 or 6 figures a year, they're like, when I get paid, right? And I'm like, okay, who's paying you? And they're like, well, my sponsors, they're supporting the show.
Yeah.
And I'm like, your sponsors are not supporting the show. Your sponsors are giving you money in advance for your audience to buy their stuff. That is the only reason that any company is going to sponsor your show. Very simply, they're going to give you money in advance because they believe that your listeners are going to hear you talk about their thing. Your listeners are going to buy their stuff, and they're going to make more money from their listeners buying their stuff than they gave to you. Full stop. So other podcasters will be like, well, I could sell a course, I could sell this, I could sell that. I'm like, yes, that's true too. So here's the one thing to remember when it comes to podcast monetization. I always say there's only one way to monetize a podcast. Only one. And that is to get your listeners to buy something.
Yeah.
That's it. It's either the stuff that you sell to them. So my listeners of Grow the Show, they either join my membership, the Grow the Show Academy, or they hire my company to come in and help them grow their show. They buy stuff from me. Other shows don't sell something directly to their listener base. They have sponsors, and so they get their audience to buy something from their sponsors. So it doesn't matter who's making the thing that your audience is buying. The only way, in my opinion, to monetize a podcast is to get that podcast's audience to buy something that you get a cut of somehow.
Right,
Either you're the owner of the business or sponsorship dollars or affiliates or whatever it is. So I said before, how do I monetize my podcast is a terrible question because it's very difficult to answer. A better question to ask is, what might my listeners want to buy based off of my recommendation?
Right.
That's it.
Right.
The answer to that question is how you monetize your podcast.
That's great. That's good advice, man. And it all comes down to having an audience in the first place, because you can't monetize nobody.
And that is why it is level 4 on the ladder, right? I see podcasters who they don't have a clear premise, they don't have retention, and they definitely don't have growth, but they got their buddy who owns a pizza shop to sponsor their show, right? So like technically, yes, they made money, that's fine. But my message is that's not sustainable, because your buddy's going to be like, what am I doing this for? Like nobody's come in to buy pizza, right?
Right.
It's you want to nail those 3 things first, and then it's okay. Now that I have this audience that is growing, now what can I offer them in order to actually make money from this thing?
Right. That's fantastic, man. Way to grow your show and ultimately make money. If that's your goal, to make money, go ahead and make money. You know, that's fantastic. I know a lot of people, they come into podcasting with 2 mindsets, like I want to have fun or I want to make money. Or the ones that say, I'm having fun now, but now later I want to make money. You see those guys too. They come in like, well, right now we're having fun, but someday we want to make, you know, a fortune. We want to quit our jobs and do this full time.
Yeah, everybody says, literally everybody says that. It has been exceedingly rare that I've come across someone who says, I'm having a blast with this, and I at no point care to monetize this. I've never
Really?
heard that ever.
Really?
Ever.
Wow.
I mean, maybe a couple times. I shouldn't speak in absolutes, right? But it's very, very uncommon. It's almost always, yeah, I really think I should monetize it. And that's actually more that I get. People are like, I've been podcasting for 5 years. This should be monetized.
Just based on the time frame.
Right. Yeah. They're like, oh, it should be monetized by now. And I'm like, that's not how this works. It's, you know, it's maybe, but like, there's no, oh, you have to do it. It's not like you serve your tenure.
Right. It's like on the clock. So many hours on the clock, you get a pay raise or something like that. It's tough work.
It is tough work. It is a lot. Like there are way quicker ways to make money, way quicker ways to make money than podcasting. And what I found is that the longer you can wait to monetize it, the more money ultimately you can make. Because the longer, yes, because I see all the time. I mean, I just had somebody email me last week. They said, I have a podcast. It gets 100 downloads per episode, if that. I don't know how to grow it, and I have no idea how to monetize it. And I just lost my job, and I think I should go all in on my podcast to, you know, replace my job. And I can't respond to every email that I get, but when I get those, I almost always respond as quickly as possible to say, I love podcasting. I'm here to serve you as much as I possibly can. You should get another job. You should get another source of you should get another source of income. And here's why. I was there. What we didn't talk about in my story is that I launched Philly Who in 2018. 6 weeks after launching the show, it got like 200 downloads an episode, which that's actually pretty good. I didn't know it at the time, but that's actually pretty solid for a show. I gave my notice. I had a 6-figure software developer job.
With 200 downloads?
200 downloads. Yep. Dude, I was 25, 26 years old. I knew forever I wanted to be this, you know, entrepreneur guy. And I was like, this is it. I got to go all in on this thing in order for it to make it my thing. Well, what I would discover is that it's very hard to grow a podcast when you have a full-time job. It is even harder to grow a podcast when you have no income. It's harder because
everything costs money. Everything.
It costs money, but it just puts you in such an urgent position and a scarcity position that your show gets worse because you're not making good content.
Really? I wondered about that.
There's so much pressure because we think if I just could work on this full time, the show would be way better. But what happens is your income goes away. And even if you have savings, that savings number starts to go down. And so you start to panic and you're like, I got to monetize this thing. What do I got to do to monetize this thing?
Right.
And then the quality of your podcast suffers. It spirals. It gets worse and worse. It makes it harder for your show to grow and monetize. And then ultimately, I've seen people get themselves in a lot of trouble financially because I want to go all in on this thing. So my message, including me, like I went into a bunch of debt until I finally, figured it out. And I don't recommend it. Like it was not a good thing. So I usually say, the longer you can wait to monetize your show, the more you can put yourself in a position to not need the show to be monetized, the more likely it is that the show will make decent money because you'll be able to make great decisions and focus on putting out a great show, growing the audience as much as you possibly can. And then there's this magical moment when your show has momentum and you have an audience, people start reaching out to you and asking you, hey, do you sell coaching? Do you sell a course? What are your recommendations for products I should buy? Your audience starts asking if you can make recommendations for what they can buy, which means they start asking you to monetize them. It's a magical moment. Not everybody gets there because most people just want to leave their job and do podcasting full time. But like I said,
I get it.
It's hard to get there, but if you can, that's the way to do it.
And the same thing goes with any kind of entrepreneur. My wife, she does a wedding business on the side, but she doesn't do it full time. People ask her like, are you doing this full time? Doing this because she knows other vendors that do it full time, and they're super stressed out when they don't have any clients coming in, or they don't have any bookings coming in, and they're super stressed out. And I mean, she gets a little worried too, like, but she's booking for next year and things like that. But it's not at the point where it is our sole income. So it's not something to really like get crazy stressed out about, where I think that if you have no other real job and you're trying to monetize a podcast or anything really, and the numbers aren't working out your way, and you don't get clients, or you don't get ads, you don't get whatever it is, you start stressing out, and maybe it's not fun anymore. And I think if it's not fun for you, the creator, anymore, it has to be fun for the listener to listen to it.
Oh my gosh. I would grab that, what you just said, and put it on every podcaster's wall. Because if that doesn't sum it up, I don't know what does.
Oh man, well, Kevin, this has been so fantastic having you on the show today, buddy. I really appreciate you stopping by and sharing all of your great wisdom about podcasting, how to grow the show, and all that fantastic stuff, man. Thanks,
Chris. This was a blast. I mean, I love talking shop, so I'm just so grateful that you had me on.
That's great, man. Where can everybody find out all about you and all your wonderful stuff?
Yeah, so, I mean, you're listening to me on a podcast right now. So the number one thing you can do is, after you're done listening to all of Chris's episodes, you can check out the Grow the Show podcast in whatever app you're using right now to hear my voice. Every single episode is meant to be an audio lesson. Most of them are just me, but sometimes I bring on guests. And the goal is every episode you leave with some sort of tactic or strategy that you can use to grow or monetize. And so that's number one. Number two is just, if you would rather get my teachings in your inbox, in your email inbox, I've got an email course called the 12 Days of Podcast Growth, totally free. It's a 12-day sequence. Every single day you get one lesson, and then by the end, you've been taught the podcast ladder in more detail. And so for that, you can just go to 12daysofpodcastgrowth.com. Number two, daysofpodcastgrowth.com.
Fantastic, man. That's great, man. Well, Kevin, you have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll catch you later, man.
Thanks, Chris. You too.